My name is Chris Averett, and I am a 2L here at the University of Florida, and I am the Secretary for the Native American Law Student Association here at the Levin College of Law. So the Native American Law Association is a relatively new organization here at the law school, and within the past year, we have been engaging students, faculty, and administration to bring attention to scholarship and opportunity presented by the field of federal Indian law. Likewise, NALSA has engaged in efforts to more adequately portray the history the University of Florida shares with indigenous cultures. These efforts include the recontextualization of the Florida historical marker commemorating what is known as the Law School Burial Mound, and the installation of an artifact display in the Lawton Chiles Law Library. Here to explain those efforts to you is Dr. George Aaron Broadwell. Dr. Broadwell is the Elling-eyed Professor of Anthropology and leads the Timucua Language project here at the University of Florida. Dr. Broadwell specializes in linguistic anthropology and focuses his research on endangered languages, primarily those of American Indian cultures. Efforts of the Timucua Language project center on understanding the culture and history of the Timucua people, as well as understanding their language and any relationship it shares with other languages.
So thank you for inviting me today. I'm just going to say a few words about the Timucua language and how it's relevant to the refurbishment of the historical marker that's going on. So the Timucua language is the language that was spoken by the indigenous people who lived in Gainesville at the time of contact. Their language, we call it Timucua. We're not quite sure what they called it themselves. This language hasn't been proven to be related to any other language in the world. So it's not the same language as Creek or Miccosukee, for example. It might be distantly related, but we're not sure. It's also not the same as the language spoken by other people, native people from South Florida, like the Calusa language. The Timucua people were devastated by war, forced labor, and disease. And the last known Timucua in Florida were relocated from St. Augustine to Cuba in 1763. There may very well be descendants of those Timucua people living in Cuba today. So despite the fact that the language is not spoken any longer, there are actually quite a lot of documents in the language. And one of the things that we're trying to do in our language project in the Department of Anthropology is to try to understand this language, try to read documents that are written in the language, try to sort of hear the voices of Timucua people from 400 years ago by reading their documents. So a little bit of the history of why is there writing in Timucua to begin with. So when the Spanish priests arrived in Florida in 1595, their mission was to convert the local people to Christianity. And to do that, they established schools to teach Timucua people to read and write their language. We know from contemporary accounts that there were schools. There were also something like spelling books and primers for students to learn to read and write their languages. And so the converts, we know, learned to recite the catechism and to say prayers, the credo, the Lord's Prayer in the Timucua language. And we also know that in the 17th century, Timucua people wrote letters to each other in their own language. Neill Wallis mentioned earlier the Timucua Rebellion of 1656. We know from the historical record that partly that rebellion was organized by people writing letters in Timucua to each other and sending them from village to village. So there was literacy here 400 years ago in the native language. So although we know that there were many letters written during that period, only 2 of them have survived, or 2 of them have been located up to this point. There's still some hope there might be other materials written in this language somewhere in archives, perhaps in Spain or Cuba. Okay. But here's an image of one of these documents. This one is called the Jesus Maria letter because at the very top of it, written in a very difficult to read handwriting, it says Jesus Maria. And this is a letter in which the writer, Don Manuel, complains that the Spanish authorities have not fulfilled their various promises to him. So they promised to provide him and his family a certain plot of land that was to be protected from the Spanish, and of course they didn't fulfill their promise. Also, Timucua people were subject to forced labor, so they were forced to be bearers for the Spanish to carry grain back and forth between here and St. Augustine, and also to do other kinds of labor for the Spanish. And so one of the projects that we're working on is we are trying to read this letter. It has a Spanish translation that was made at about the same time, but the Timucua letter is about twice as long as its translation. So presumably it additionally says other things that are not reflected in the translation. It is a hard letter to read, but we are working on trying to read this letter and understand what the point of view expressed in this letter is. There's another letter from the 17th century where local leaders asked the Spanish authorities to retain a favored local governor who was named Don Diego. He was apparently less brutal or harsh than other governors, and there was a threat that he was going to be replaced. We're also working on reading that letter. There also are actually quite a lot of published books, so probably 7 of these. Some of them are quite long, some of them are small pamphlets of only a couple pages. But this is one of the longest and most interesting books in the language. This is called the Confessionario. It was published, actually, my slide is wrong. The Confessionario is published in 1613, not 1612. But this is a confessional. It's translated into the Timucua language. And when you read it, there's actually some famous material in here that ask about traditional religious and cultural practices. So I'm just giving you one example here. There's a part in here where people who were confessing before receiving the Eucharist were asked a series of questions about whether or not they were continuing in their traditional cultural practices. So one of the questions here in Timucua, it says, Nimota ukwata ituhuta honosonoma, enesota onocosta ituhuta ikwene hale manda bohobicho. And my translation of this is given below. Did you believe, taking horns and praying, I will see the deer, and by doing this I will pray and kill it? That's what I think it says. The Spanish translation is just slightly different. So the Spanish says, in order to hunt some deer, did you take the antlers of another deer and pray over them the demon's ceremony? So these say fairly different things. The more carefully you look at this document, the more different the Timucua is from its apparent Spanish translation. So we think it's actually a very valuable source for understanding the native point of view on a lot of issues during this period. Now, I don't want to overemphasize this. It's not a whole-scale rebellion against Catholicism or the Spanish, but it's, I believe, often the point of view of Christian converts among the Timucua trying to express the Christian faith in their own words, using some of their own ideas, and also not containing as many of the editorial comments of the Spanish about things like the demon ceremony. So you're not here to learn all about the Timucua language, but I wanted to talk a little bit about this because it's relevant to the refurbishment of the sign that we're trying to do. We decided it would be most appropriate to try to include some material in the Timucua language on the sign. And our basis for trying to understand how to say things in Timucua is based on careful reading of these documents, trying to build a dictionary and write a grammar of this language so that we can understand it better. So in order to do that, we look at the Confessionario. 2 other long, important documents are these. This is a catechism from 1612 on the left, and on the right is a 1635, what's called a doctrina. This is a long, believe it or not, 300-page monolingual book in Timucua. It's translated from a European original, which we have found. So what we are doing now is we're diligently working to compare the European original with the Timucua translation, and we find multiple interesting disparities between those as well. Okay, so how is this relevant? This is the sign that is currently at the burial mound, and we wanted to rewrite both the front and the back of this sign in a way that would be more appropriate, both to respect the people who lived here 400 years ago or 1,000 years ago, as well as to convey more information to a modern reader. So this is the current sign, and this is a mock-up of what we propose as an alternative. So Neill Wallis and I worked on the different sides of this sign. This is the front of the sign now. So the proposed rewording will say, "This earthen mound pays tribute to the ancestors of the Timucua Indians who lived in north central Florida. Around 1,000 years ago, following millennia of occupation by Native American peoples near Lake Alice, the Timucua marked this location as sacred with the initiation of a cemetery. They buried several individuals in a central grave and then constructed a small earthen mound over them. Over the years, additional burials were laid on the mound surface and covered with earth, especially on the southeastern side, resulting in a 2-meter-high mound with an oval-shaped footprint. The archaeological site was scientifically excavated by University of Florida archaeologists and students in 1976, and today is protected within the Law School Woods Conservation Area across the street from where we are right now. This site is sacred to Native peoples. Please show respect to this place." And the back of them tells a little bit about what we know about the Timucua people during the more oriented towards the mission period, 17th century, 16th and 17th century. So it says, "The indigenous people who live near this site are known to us as the Timucua, belonging to the subdivision called Potano, that was the local chieftainship. They lived in this part of North Florida when Europeans arrived in the 16th century. Our knowledge about them comes from archaeological sites like this one and from historical records from the Spanish colonial period. A Spanish mission called San Francisco de Potano was established about 10 miles north of here in 1606. The descendants of the people buried here were probably part of the system of Catholic missions during this region. Untold numbers of Timucua people died from war, forced labor during the 17th and 18th centuries. This marker is intended to honor the memory of the first people of Alachua County using words from their language. And here the words we selected were Naeba Hiono Manta Nahiobo Tanikano. We remember them with compassion." Thanks.
All right, to close the ceremony, we want to bring up Dr. Wallis again. Dr. Wallis is going to explain kind of the artifact display that we've erected in the Lawton Chiles Library. And I guess we've already covered your background, but without further ado, Dr. Wallis.
Thanks. Well, after talking this over with NALSA, we decided to put together a display that was basically representative of Native people of North Central Florida, basically covering as much time and diversity as possible in a small case. So within the case, we have, well, let me go back. So we have a map that shows some of the Native groups in Florida around 500 years ago. We have a kind of mock scene from a diorama that shows what life might have been like in the past here. We have representative stone artifacts like ground stone axes or adzes that are made of non-local material, but they're actually quite common in North Florida. We have various kinds of chert flake stone tools, drills, and blade tools, and humpbacked planers. used for woodworking. We have various kinds of bifaces from some of the early ones. These are 6,000-year-old hafted bifaces into some of the arrowheads of only about 500 years ago. We have an assortment of bone pins that could have been used as awls or punches or fids for making things like baskets and cordage. A perforated shark's tooth. These were made out of fossilized shark's teeth that are local to North Florida, but also modern sharks brought in from the coast. Then we have an assortment of pottery. I have a little bit better image of some of these examples. Some of the earliest pottery in North America, this fiber-tempered pottery from 4,000 years ago, and then various kinds of surface treatments, decorations that we find on pottery with various kinds of punctations and check-stamped impressions. And actually some of these sherds come from a site that's just about half a mile from the law school, called the Ruffin Pond site that I helped excavate a few years ago. And then we have more recent peoples represented by these Seminole artifacts. And these are basically representing the descendants of Seminoles were here in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Seminole doll from the 1930s. We have this photograph of Ruby Tigertail. The Tigertail family were really prominent in the Everglades in the early 1900s, setting up the first trading post in the Everglades. And she's wearing these beads that are really iconic among historic Seminoles. And we have a blue glass faceted bead in the case as well. And then a basket, a Miccosukee basket made with palmetto fibers. And so that's the contents of the case. And I hope that the small case is fairly representative of Native peoples from North Central Florida. And I'd like to thank collection manager Donna Rule for all of her work in helping put this together, and also the assistance of Lorraine Duerden in putting this together as well. Thanks a lot.
So in closing, I want to thank everybody for sticking around. I know it's kind of a long day, and a lot of scholars talking kind of tends to draw out. But I appreciate everybody staying in. What we're trying to do is lay the foundation for a lot of things that we hope in the future will come to fruition. Throughout this entire process, Chris and I have kind of been waiting for the wheels to fall off, and everybody we've encountered has been more than willing to bend over backwards to help us achieve our goals. And like I said, this is just the foundation. We want to kind of introduce everybody to a lot of these concepts. To a lot of people, this is all new and novel. To some of the people who have been around these cultures and communities, this may be a precursor or kind of obvious statements, but we want to expose people to things they haven't seen or heard or thought about otherwise. Hopefully we can get into some more of the advanced stuff at a later point. And there's a lot of people we want to thank. Neill, Dr. Broadwell, Tanner, essentially everybody in the room at one point or another. Almost everybody's interacted with this at some point. Marcus, Dr. Church. There's a bunch of people who have contributed to this, and the administration has bent over again backwards to make this come to fruition. And I mean, I can't honestly thank everybody here and everybody who's been participating in this enough, because like I said, this has exceeded all of our expectations. We didn't think this would come to a reality, and it's come to fruition way quicker than we ever could have anticipated, and beyond our wildest expectations. So with a heartfelt thank you, I want to pass it to Chris.
Yeah, I echo Adam's sentiment. Thank you, everybody. Mostly the efforts of the Native American Law Student Association. I think those are a lot of students who stepped up and kind of got involved in something that maybe wasn't something they expected to get involved in here, but I think it's been very rewarding for a lot of us. And so with that, we invite you to enjoy some refreshments and some food outside. And then we also have the artifact case that Dr. Wallis just explained is set up in the library for your viewing. So thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Let me just add thanks to you guys for taking this initiative. When you did start, I thought you were quite all too. But you guys stuck with it and pulled together resources and a lot of goodwill, a lot of good ideas, and it's coming together. Congratulations. So thank you.
Maybe small or do a class.